Okay.
Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for coming back for the second week in our Thank you for coming back for the second week in our exploration of Paul's last and greatest letter, the Epistle to the Romans. Last week, I mentioned that the idea for this course was born in a dinner conversation with Pete and Mary Minter when Pete shared that the words of Romans chapter 8, nothing can separate us from the love of God in Jesus Christ. Those words came into his heart and mind as he faced a critical operation in the hospital. After our class last week, I received a reference from the other Larry Hofsis, to an essay in the September issue of the Christian Century. And I think everyone in the class would benefit from reading that essay because it helps us to make the connection between the precarious moment in which we are now living and the crisis that Paul faced 2,000 years ago. So, Larry Hofsis, if there is any way to share with the class a link to that article in the Christian Century, I found it so profoundly insightful, and I've been thinking about it all week. Last week, we explored the situation in which Paul wrote Romans, the situation in the Roman Empire, that is to say, the gathering clouds of war between Rome and Jerusalem. We also looked at the situation in Paul's life and ministry. Paul says that he stands at the end of his work in the Eastern Mediterranean. The rising tide of opposition to Paul's community of reconciliation, including Jews and Gentiles, and no longer subject to the law. Jewish Christian apostles invaded Paul's communities across the frontier in Asia Minor and in Greece. And so Paul has decided to go on to Spain and to begin an ambitious new work of community foundation. Paul wrote his letter to the Romans in order to appeal to the Roman Christians to support his new mission work in faraway Spain. And finally, last week, we talked about the situation in the church at Rome. We discovered that the Roman church was diverse and mixed. There were both Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. And by a close reading of Romans 14:1 to 15:13, we discovered that there were tensions within the Roman church between Jewish and Gentile Christ believers. Now, at the very end of our class last week, I suggested that as Paul plans to journey through Rome on his way to Spain, he was faced by a difficult challenge, namely his critics and opponents. The apostles from Jerusalem have already preceded Paul to Rome, and they are spreading, evidently, among the Roman Christians a representation of Paul's theology that endangers Paul's appeal for the support of the Roman Christians. John, if we are now able to display the text that I sent you for today, and if you are in person there at Epiphany, you have paper copies. Look at the first verse on our handout. Romans chapter 3, verse 8. Paul says, "And why not say, as some people slander us by saying that we say, let us do evil so that good may come. Their judgment is deserved." Well, in this text, it is clear, unambiguously, that Paul has to reckon with a representation of his teaching that he regards as slander. Behind a text like this stands the accusation that Paul's gospel of righteousness, justification before God, no longer on the basis of obedience to the law, but rather by a more fundamental response of the whole human being to God, to which Paul gives the Greek name pistis. We ordinarily translate pistis with the English word faith. But 2,000 years ago in Greek, pistis meant something more than, much more than, intellectual assent or belief. It meant the complete yes saying of the whole human being to a higher power. Pistis designates complete trust in God, and it might be better translated with the word faithfulness. So Paul's opponents, his critics, have argued that by preaching that a person is made right with God, that a person is established in a right relationship with God, not by obeying the law, but by faithfulness and trust. Well, Paul's critics say that amounts to encouraging people to go on sinning so that God's grace may abound. Just go on doing evil. You don't need to obey the law. God will save you by your faithfulness. Now, there is evidence within the Epistle to the Romans itself that the Christ followers at Rome in the time of Paul were a mixed group. Jewish Christian believers and Gentile believers. And this recognition, the recognition that Paul is addressing a mixed group of people who are experiencing tension and conflict, and that Paul's letter to the Romans seeks to articulate a theological foundation for a community of reconciliation, a community that includes both Jews and Gentiles. That insight into the purpose of Romans has grown among scholars since the end of World War II. Before that time, Romans was regarded as a kind of treatise or essay on salvation for every individual. But now scholars are much more conscious of the fact that Paul's aim is the reconciliation of peoples, Jews and Gentiles, reconciled in a new kind of human community. The turning point in a scholar's understanding of the purpose of Romans came when a remarkable New Testament scholar, Krister Stendahl, who taught New Testament at Harvard and who later became bishop, the Lutheran Bishop of Stockholm in Sweden. Stendahl, after World War II, when he was a very young man, served as a chaplain in the concentration camps among the people who had been reduced to the ground zero of humanity by Hitler's regime in the concentration camps. And my wife Diane may recall that when we had dinner with Krister Stendahl at one of the annual meetings of the Society of Biblical Literature, he related to us the moment when his experience as a chaplain in the concentration camps changed the way that he read the Epistle to the Romans. Stendahl began to understand that the ultimate purpose of Romans was not to articulate a plan of salvation for each individual, but rather the vision of reconciliation between peoples. And Stendahl shared that breakthrough insight with groups of people around the United States and Europe all through the 1960s when he was a professor at Harvard, and eventually he published a little book entitled Paul Among Jews and Gentiles. And if I had to recommend one book for our class to read, it would be that little book. You can get a cheap copy of a paperback at Amazon, and the book is short enough that you could read the whole book in one afternoon. Well, Stendahl changed everything. Now, confirmation of Stendahl's insight that Romans aims ultimately at the reconciliation of peoples in Christ on the edge of the great and cataclysmic war that destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. Confirmation of that hypothesis is provided by attention to the form of Paul's discourse, what literary critics would call the genre of Romans. Way back at the beginning of the 20th century, the great New Testament scholar, German Rudolf Bultmann, who I am proud to number among my ancestors. He is my academic great-grandfather, and a larger-than-life picture of Bultmann is on the wall of my office at Fordham University. Bultmann published his dissertation entitled The Diatribe and Paul's Letter to the Romans. It was finally translated about 15 years ago. It was a little book in which Bultmann observed that the technique that Paul uses in the Epistle to the Romans is almost identical to the teaching technique employed by ancient Stoic philosophers like Epictetus, who used the diatribe in his classroom. Now, when I speak of Romans as a diatribe, today in common parlance, the word diatribe designates an angry speech, a rant criticizing someone. There is a man who you can encounter almost every day of the week in Fordham Plaza outside the gate of my university. He has a microphone and a big amplifier, and to all those who pass by, he shouts out a stern word of rebuke. In fact, his attention focused on me the other day, Joan, and he labeled me an academic hypocrite in front of hundreds of people in Fordham Plaza. Well, that's what comes into our mind when we use the word diatribe. But 2,000 years ago, the Greek word diatribe had a different meaning. It described a dialogue between a teacher and his students. In the classroom, the teacher would call out. He would call out one or more students and begin a series of questions and answers in order to lead those students into a deeper knowledge of a subject, ultimately to lead them to the truth. Well, that is the technique that Paul is using. And when a letter or a text is given the form of a diatribe, the students with whom the author is engaged are imaginary interlocutors. So Paul's letter was designed to be read out loud in the assembly of the Roman Christ believers. And I want to show you how Paul uses the diatribe. Paul is aware that he is addressing a mixed audience, an audience of Gentiles and Jews. In the first part of Paul's argument in Romans chapter 1, verse 18, to the end of the first chapter, Paul is speaking directly to the Gentile majority in the Roman church. And he describes for them in graphic and terrible terms the catastrophic fall of the Gentile world into sin. In particular, he describes the sociopathology of Nero's Rome. And then in chapter 2, verse 17, Paul turns to the Jewish side of the audience, and he calls out as his interlocutor a particular Jewish Christian in the audience. Joan, would you display again for us the text, and I'll ask you all to refer to the second text on your handout, Romans chapter 2, verses 17 to 24. Isn't this interesting? Paul turns from the Gentile side of the assembly to the Jewish side, and he says, so to speak, oh, you Jewish Christians over there, probably you have been nodding your head in agreement with everything that I've said about the sinfulness and depravity of Nero's Rome. Well, what about you? Is your life fully righteous? And you can see here that Paul directly addresses a Jewish Christian. But if you call yourself a Jew and you rely on the law and boast about your relation to God, and you know his will and determine what really matters because you are instructed in the law, and if you are so sure that you are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness. He's really drilling it home, isn't he? A corrector of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth. You then, who teach others, will you not teach yourself? You preach against stealing, but do you steal? You forbid adultery, but do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, do you dishonor God by your transgression of the law? For it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Now, Paul's employment of the diatribal style is so complete that at several moments in the letter, Paul permits his Jewish Christian interlocutor to interrupt him. For example, in Romans chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, it is the Jewish Christian in Paul's audience who speaks up directly. After having heard Paul's argument that a person is established in a right relationship with God by a fundamental response of the whole human being, to which Paul gives the name pistis, the Jewish Christian in the audience has heard enough. He speaks up and he says, well, what then are we to say was gained by Abraham, our ancestor according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about. And at several other places, as we will explore next week, the Jewish Christian interlocutor in the audience interrupts Paul and lodges objections to Paul's argument. So there is now a much greater recognition among scholars that Paul is addressing a mixed community of people. At some points, Paul speaks directly to the Gentiles in the church at Rome at the beginning of the epistle. In Romans chapter 1, verses 5 and 6, Paul says about himself, through whom we have received grace and apostleship for the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles on behalf of his name, among whom you yourselves are. So now you can see Paul is speaking clearly to the Gentile Christians in his audience. And again, in Romans chapter 1, verse 13, Paul says, I don't want you to be ignorant, brothers and sisters, that I have often desired to come to you, but I have been hindered up until now, in order that I may reap some fruit among you, just as among the rest of the Gentiles. So at points it is clear that Paul is speaking to the Gentile side of the audience. And as we have seen in Romans chapter 2, verse 17, Paul addresses Jewish Christians directly. Indeed, in 2 weeks, we will immerse ourselves in Paul's argument in Romans chapters 9 to 11, where Paul struggles with the fact that the majority of his own kinspeople, the Jews, have not accepted Jesus as the Messiah, and Paul's painful, heartfelt meditation upon the future of his own people, the Jews, in the providence of God. Those chapters, Romans 9 to 11, clearly presuppose that Paul is speaking to and with Jewish Christian members of his audience. So in terms of discerning the purpose of Romans, what has now been recognized by scholars is that in this great letter, Paul is attempting to bring about reconciliation between peoples. And colleagues, we need that message today in a world that is increasingly polarized and isolated. In our nation, with a government that is so deeply divided that it is dysfunctional, with people who don't speak to each other, who live in media silos and echo chambers, we very much need Paul's vision of a reconciled humanity as the horizon of what is possible. We need to reclaim that vision. Now, I would like to begin with your help to analyze the argument of Romans. And there is a general consensus among scholars. Larry Hofsas knows from his time studying in the seminary and at the University of Heidelberg that a consensus among New Testament scholars is a very rare thing. But there is something approaching a consensus that the thesis statement of Paul's letter to the Romans is to be found in Romans chapter 1, verses 16 to 17. And Joan, if we could now go back to that text, I would like to ask for your help in unpacking and unraveling Paul's thesis statement. Paul's articulation of this thesis is so concise. It is so concentrated. It is like, I would compare it to a strand of DNA. In a strand of DNA, all of the genetic material of our bodies are encoded in that little strand. And the same is true of Paul's thesis statement here in Romans chapter 1, verses 16 to 17. So with your help, class, I would like to unpack this statement, to unravel the DNA step by step. Paul begins with the words, "For I am not ashamed of the good news," the gospel, the euangelion. Well, why would Paul be ashamed of the good news about Jesus? Why does he begin by disavowing shame? Well, the answer, I think, is clear. This letter is addressed to the capital of the world, the capital of the Roman Empire. It is addressed to Nero's Rome. And within a few years of the composition of Romans, Nero blamed the Christians for the great fire that burned 2/3 of the largest city in the world. And he designed exquisite tortures for the Christians, humiliating them for their way of life, labeling them as arsonists. So Paul begins by saying, I am not ashamed of this gospel, even though it is a message about a crucified carpenter turned rabbi who died on a Roman cross. It is easy to see why Paul feared that the message about the crucified Messiah might be a subject of shame. So then Paul continues, it is God's saving power. The Greek word that Paul uses here for power is the word dunamis. And it is from that word that we get what English word? Dynamite. I heard someone say it. That's right. The gospel is God's dynamite. It is capable of exploding the continuum of Roman power. It is capable of awakening people who have lived in the shadow of death and fear, who have been confined by the structure of power to a dead place, who have been objectified. This message is God's dynamite. And Paul says it is that for everyone who has pistis. Now, this is one of the first occurrences of the Greek word pistis and the verb form pisteuein in the letter. And as I mentioned earlier, in the Greek word that Paul was using 2,000 years ago, pistis does not designate a mental attitude. When we say today, do you believe in Santa Claus? Ever since the Enlightenment, belief and faith has been reduced to a subjective mental attitude, mental assent to a proposition. But that is not what the word meant for Paul. Paul says the gospel is dynamite, capable of exploding the continuum of power and awakening people to a new life, a life worth living for everyone who completely relies upon it, who puts trust in it. And notice that in the next phrase, Paul already signals his purpose of reconciling Jews and Greeks. He says, this gospel was for the Jew first. The gospel was announced for the first time in Palestine, in the green hills of Galilee, and then in Judea. But now it is also for the Greeks, for non-Jews. Now we come to the heart of Paul's thesis statement, the next verse, Romans 1:17. And it begins like this: for in it. Now, the little word it, of course, is a pronoun. And in order to grasp what is intended by the pronoun, we need to identify what? The antecedent, right? Well, the antecedent of the little word it is the gospel. In the message about Jesus, his death and resurrection, in that message, the righteousness of God is unveiled. The veil is lifted off of it. Now, the key word here is the Greek word righteousness. It is the Greek word dikaiosune. I know that's a long word. Can everybody in class say that with me? Dikaiosune. One more time. Dikaiosune.
Dikaiosune.
It is so important. We ordinarily translate dikaiosune as righteousness. And that's correct, that's proper, but righteousness has an exclusively religious connotation, something spiritual. In the Greek language 2,000 years ago, dikaiosune also means justice. Justice in an ethical and even a political sense. When Plato uses the word dikaiosune in his great dialogue, The Republic, he's talking about justice as the goal of a human community. Now, what does Paul mean when he speaks about the dikaiosune of God? Well, I'm convinced that Paul is taking this concept from his Bible. The New Testament had not yet been written. Paul is in the process of writing new scriptures. So for Paul and his fellow Christians, the scripture was the scripture of Israel, the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, what we call the Old Testament. So if you use a concordance and you look up the Greek word dikaiosune and you go back to the Old Testament prophets who use that word, guess what you find? You find 2 or 3 passages that I believe are clearly informing Paul's thought. Number 1, the victory song of Deborah in Judges chapter 5, verse 11. Hebrew Bible scholars recognize that this song of Deborah, a female leader and judge who led the people of Israel to an unexpected victory over the Philistines. And Deborah composed a victory song. It is one of the oldest pieces of poetry in the Hebrew Bible, back on the edge of recorded literary history. And here's what Deborah says. She says, there, where the battle took place, where the Israelites, with God's help, defeated the Philistines, there in the future, generations will sing about the dikaiosune of God. The Hebrew word is tzedakah. The Greek word is dikaiosune. In this case, the word clearly means God's power to make right. in a world where it seems that everything is going wrong. God brought about an unexpected victory for people who were being oppressed. God's dikaiosune is God's power to make right in a world where everything seems to be wrong. Class, I have to confess to you that I wake up here in my little apartment in the Bronx on many mornings and find myself inwardly, silently praying, "Oh God, won't you do something quick? Won't you intervene, oh God, in our terrible world where it seems like everything is going wrong, where it seems like we are drifting toward another world war." So I think that's the first thing that righteousness means for Paul. It means God's power to make right in a world where everything is going wrong. The second text that I think is informing Paul's thought is the prophet Amos, chapter 5. Amos was a prophet from the north, from the northern part of Israel. He came down to Jerusalem because God called him, and he prophesied judgment upon the people of Jerusalem for abusing and humiliating the poor and for their corruption of the temple. And in Amos chapter 5, Amos says that God's righteousness will be experienced by a disobedient people as a day of judgment. Now, in this case, Amos is asserting that God is righteous. God's nature is righteousness. God embodies justice. And because God is righteous, God will not tolerate evil and injustice among those with whom God has entered into a covenantal relationship. So I think that's the second thing that Paul means when he uses the word righteousness. He means two things: that God makes right and that God is righteous. And God calls upon all humanity to share in the divine justice and righteousness. Now let's go back to our thesis statement, because the most difficult and complicated part is right at the end of verse 17. This righteousness of God has, Paul says, is now in Paul's own day. It has been revealed, unveiled. How? The English translation that you see in front of you says, through faith, for faith. Now, the Greek phrase that is translated through faith, for faith, literally means out of faith or faithfulness into faith or faithfulness. Let me read for you the actual Greek so you can hear it. It is ek pisteos eis piston. Out of pistis into pistis. Oh, that's concentrated. That is formulaic. And in order to understand Paul, we have to unpack it. In the course of Paul's great letter to the Romans, it becomes clear that the first part of that statement, out of pistis, applies to Jesus himself. It was the faithfulness of Jesus. It was Jesus' radical obedience to God. It was the fact that Jesus said yes to God with all of his life and did God's will, even though it cost him his life. It is that radical obedience, Paul believes, which replicates itself in those who hear about it. So the little phrase, out of pistis, into pistis, describes the movement of the faithfulness that has now revealed the righteousness of God in human history. It begins with Jesus's faithfulness. And when people hear about that, when they hear that there was one who trusted God so much that he died for all people and even for sinners, it is when you hear about that message that the faithfulness of Jesus replicates itself in your life, in your heart and mind. Now, if colleagues, you are listening to me and you're thinking, wait a minute, that's a very different understanding than the traditional one. Luther, of course, taught that we are made right with God, established in a right relationship with God, not by works of the law, but by faith. But if you go back and read Luther in detail, when Luther talked about justification by faith, he was not talking merely about a subjective mental attitude. Luther knew Greek, and he was aware that when Paul uses that word, he's talking about the yes saying of a whole human being to God. Now, New Testament scholars have finally caught up with Luther in the last few years. There is a California New Testament scholar named Sam K. Williams, wrote his PhD at Harvard, and his dissertation was revised and published. And in the modern period, Sam Williams argued convincingly for the first time that when Paul speaks about justification by faith, he's not talking about faith in Jesus. He's not talking about the believer's faith in Jesus. Paul is talking about Jesus's faith, the faithfulness of Jesus to the will of God, which replicates itself in those who hear about it. Sam Williams' book was then taken up by a scholar who now teaches at Duke, named Richard Hayes, and he published a book entitled The Faith and Faithfulness of Jesus. Well, that is a dramatic shift in understanding. What Paul means to describe as the basis for a right life is not our belief or faith in Jesus. It is Jesus's complete trust and radical obedience to God, which replicates itself in us. And so the last phrase of Romans chapter 1, verse 17, the one who is righteous will live by faith. A more literal translation of that phrase would be, the one who is righteous out of faithfulness or trust will live. Now, I think Paul intended that phrase, which is a quotation, by the way, of Habakkuk, chapter 2, verse 14. That's why it's printed in quotation marks here. Paul intended that scripture quotation to apply, first of all, to Jesus himself. Jesus is the one who was shown to be righteous by his radical faithfulness to God, and therefore he now what? Lives. He lives by the power of the resurrection. God vindicated his life. So Paul intends for that phrase to apply first of all to Jesus. But as Paul will later explicate, when he returns to the thesis statement and explicates that more fully in Romans chapter 3, verses 21 to 26, Paul believes that those who have been called, who have been grasped by the power of the gospel, they too will live. Their lives will become righteous if, like Jesus, they say yes to God with their whole human being. Now, Joan, I'm looking at the time, and I'm afraid we are approaching the end of our time together, and I want to open it up for questions and comments, because some of what you have heard today may be different than a traditional interpretation of Romans. So, questions, comments?
Larry, are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can.
I wonder if in the Great Commission, where Jesus said to his disciples, "Go therefore and make disciples," and the critical part is of all nations,
yes,
then by baptizing them and teaching them. That oftentimes has been interpreted as individualistic, that we're to go to all nations and encounter individuals and somehow attract them to the faith. Is it, as I have heard, possible that those Greek words there, ta, panta, ethne, the ethne is not really nations, because in some ways the gospel's already been to all the nations in the world, the Bible has. And we kind of think, well, maybe there's nothing left to do. But if you interpret the ethne as people groups, as I think you were saying, then there's a lot to do. Haven't done too much with the poor, haven't done too much with, people groups. So in this case, would it be that Paul's passion for Jews and Greeks, the people groups, would already be embedded in Jesus' Great Commission?
Oh, I think you're exactly right, Larry. You're right on so many levels. First, grammatically, the Greek word ethne is plural, and you can see that from the plural article, ta ethne, the peoples, the peoples. So our tendency to interpret the Great Commission and Paul's gospel individualistically is contrary to the meaning that the word has in Greek. So we are commissioned, as we will discover later when we analyze Romans chapter 5, We, as followers of the faithful Jesus, have been given as our mission the reconciliation of peoples. And you're right, Larry, that is needed. Oh, that's needed so desperately now. At least in my lifetime, there's never been a moment when reconciliation of peoples has been so desperately needed. And Paul commissions us, just as Jesus did, to be about that. Other questions, comments?
Yeah, Larry?
Yes.
Ray Peterson here. So I was wondering about this addressing the Greek Gentiles and the Jewish Christians in Rome.
Yes.
It also seems to me that he actually employs language, especially when addressing the Greeks, that would have been familiar and comfortable to maybe those Greek-speaking Gentiles that were that had Stoic inclinations, right? Especially in chapter 1.
Yes.
And then again in chapter 8, it seems to me that the language takes on a distinct Platonic character, right? And perhaps he's speaking in that way as well. So is that plausible that he's actually in these first 8 chapters, it seems like he's giving the same message or a similar message, but he's sort of doing it 3 times, for the different audiences that might be there in the Roman community. Is that?
Oh, you're absolutely right, Ray. And your point that Paul's language resonates with motifs and themes and topics that were being used by Greek thinkers, by Stoics, by Platonists. You're absolutely right. In recent years, scholars have paid more attention to the images, the statues, the coins, the bas-reliefs, the wall paintings that surrounded Paul and his readers. And the images that are found there would have constituted a part of the environment in which Paul's language is echoing and resonating. As we work together in the coming weeks, I will bring into our class some of those images, the iconography that Paul's language would have called to mind. People who read Paul's letters could not have avoided thinking about the ways in which Roman imperial propagandists at the time sought to enforce obedience to Nero. And so you are absolutely right, Ray, in sensing that in order to fully understand how Paul's message would have been understood, would have been received and interpreted, we have to bring around the letter the echo chamber of discourse and images that Paul presupposes, right? He presupposes that people are going to the theater and that they are walking about in the city and looking at the monuments. And Paul's language evokes all of that. And thank you, Ray, for encouraging me to go further down that road in coming weeks. Joan, I see that once again I have transgressed our time limit. Mark Twain said it's a terrible death to be talked to death, and you're in danger of dying that death. So I will pause here and let you escape, but I will be with you whether by Zoom or in person next week and the week following I'm still negotiating my travel schedule. Thanks to everyone for participating today.
Thank you.
And please come back next week.
We will. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Don't